The Tank, 1917. Most men in the front line would have considered transporting the dead from the field hospital to the burial pits about 5 miles behind the lines a soft job. But it was hard and often revolting work getting the corpses out of the truck and carrying them over to where the burial parties waited, shovels in hands. There had been days of heavy rain, and as Privates Ernst Huber and Friedrich Seidel manhandled yet another cadaver from the vehicle, their boots sank deep into the sticky mud, making progress an exhausting and uncomfortable matter. The two men panted and swore as they waded through the morass, before finally laying their cold burden down before the gravediggers, who wore weary and sombre expressions and rarely spoke. The pair tried not to look down at the mutilated, silent corpses that were already laid out in a long row along the bottom of the freshly opened trench. Private Otto Baumann, by contrast, watched the work going on with a feeling of self-satisfaction and contentment. It had stopped raining for the time being, and the clouds had lifted just a little. For this time of year, if you could ignore the chilliness of the mist, it was almost a pleasant day. Baumann was fully conscious, furthermore, of the fact that being detailed for work like this was much preferable to risking life and limb in an exposed trench under artillery fire just a few miles over the horizon. Even now the ground under his feet shook under the distant concussion of exploding shells, their faraway booms tolling irregularly like vast, tuneless bells. No, it had been a lucky day when he had accompanied a wounded officer to the field hospital and had managed to find a way to stay there after claiming a knowledge of driving trucks. And it had only been a partial lie, as he had often watched them going by the dingy house where he had been brought up by his largely indifferent and frequently arrested relatives. As Privates Huber and Seidel sloshed their way back towards him, Baumann turned from his pacific contemplation of the scene to continue rifling methodically through the pockets of the remaining dead. He did not expect to find money or other valuables, as they would have been purloined by other hands long before, but that was not what he was after. It was surprising how many times he would find in an otherwise empty wallet or pocketbook a photograph of the girl the dead man had left behind. They were his particular interest, his private passion. He felt no pity for the dead themselves. They were just so much meat now, and fools to get themselves killed in the first place, and he had no compunction about helping himself to their photographs of wives and sweethearts. They would only go to waste after all, rotting away in the sopping earth with their former owners. Better by far that he cherish them by adding them to his collection. Huber and Seidel dragged themselves back to the truck and began to remove the next corpse. The caps and greatcoats of both men were heavily spattered with mud and stained in several places with blood. "Why don't you give us a hand instead of lounging about?" Huber growled at Baumann. Baumann smirked at him. "I'm the driver. It's not my job." Huber swore. Then he and Seidel set off once more across the cratered, sucking ground. Baumann finished checking the last body and settled in the cab to sift through his haul. He frowned. They weren't the prettiest women, this lot, though one of them at least had a good, sturdy figure that he approved of. After looking through them all, he took each photograph one by one and carefully tore off any children, husbands, or lovers who were included in the portrait and discarded the unwanted images in the mud. He enjoyed the process of stealing other men's women this way. Even where the photograph showed only the girl herself, he still ripped the edges of the picture, as though claiming her through this obscure act of possession. The other two men eventually rejoined him in the cab, their job done at last. They looked exhausted. "You're a selfish bastard for not helping us," Huber grated. "Any decent man would have taken his share of the work." Bauman ignored him and showed them the choicest specimen from his booty. "Look at her. I bet she could make you feel better, hein?" he taunted them both. "One day I'll have a woman like that, and I'll spit in your faces when you stare at her in the street." Private Seidel snorted sourly. "No woman in her right mind would so much as glance at an evil, ugly bastard like you." "I pity any woman who comes within a mile of you," Huber muttered. "You're an animal. You disgust me." Private Seidel gave his neighbour a nudge with his elbow. "Forget it," he warned in a low voice. "Remember what he did to Muller." Bauman pretended he did not hear and smiled at the picture in his hand. "She'll make a fine addition to my collection." "Put it away, for God's sake," Huber pleaded. Taking his time, Bauman pulled out the bulging wad of photographs he kept in his tunic pocket and added his latest prizes to it. "There we are, my darlings," he told them cheerfully. "You belong to Otto now." "You should show more respect," Huber added as Bauman tucked the wad safely away. "The dead watch us, you know." Bauman barked a swift laugh. "You think so, do you?" he sneered. "The dead are watching us, are they? Well, here's to them." So saying, he swung out of the cab, slipped down his trousers, and bared his buttocks in the direction of the burial party. "For Christ's sake, get back in before someone sees," Huber stuttered, appalled. Bauman casually straightened and pulled his trousers up, then resumed his place behind the wheel with a jovial grin on his face. No one spoke as they set off on the short journey back to the field hospital. There was a constant flow of dead bodies from the surgeons' tents, and they knew from experience that a fresh row of corpses would be waiting for them to load up and transport down this same doleful road. Both sides seemed to be locked in a stalemate, and rumours that the Americans were finally on their way after President Wilson declared war back in April made it seem unlikely that the tide of corpses would ebb any time soon. About a mile into their journey, they reached a low point where the road was crossed by a stream. They had only just managed to get through it on their way to the burial pits. Now it was clear that rainwater had made it impassable, and they would have to take another route. Bauman swore at the necessity to make a detour, which he knew would take at least twice as long. As he steered the truck down a narrower, equally muddy track that wended its way through the desolate landscape behind the lines, his sunny mood evaporated, and his expression darkened. "You know why we're stuck out here and can't go home?" he challenged the other two men. "None of all, I'll tell you. It's all the fault of those cowardly British and their arse-licking colonial slaves. I ask you, why did those worms, the Australians and Canadians, want to get involved? And the filthy Indians, too. Sikhs and Gurkhas, even. What business is it of theirs? No business at all. But the British need them to do their dirty work for them. They aren't capable of doing it themselves. And how many good Germans must die because of it? How many? Too many. When we win the war, we should put that Lord George up against a wall and shoot him." The other two men kept their silence. They had heard it all before, and they knew better than to risk their companion's vicious temper. "The way I see it," Bauman continued, as they jolted through yet another muddy puddle, "the purpose of this war is to put Germany where she belongs, above all other nations. There is no other solution." He slapped the steering wheel with his fist. "Nothing else will be acceptable to the German people. It is inevitable that Britain must surrender without condition, acknowledge German superiority, hand her colonies over to us, and then—" He stopped abruptly and stamped on the brake. The truck slithered to a stop in the mud. "Look!" he exclaimed, eyes wide. "What the hell is that?" They had just crested a low ridge. In the misty hollow into which the track dipped ahead of them was a huge, dark shape, like a colossal metal slug. It was a massive, armoured vehicle of some kind, with metal tracks that ran all the way around its rhomboid sides. Machine-gun barrels spiked from sponsons on the hull sides. "It must be one of those British landships we've heard so much about," Seidel whispered in awe. British? Echoed Bauman in an equally small voice. Well, we don't have any, do we? Seidel replied impatiently. What's a British landship doing behind our lines? Asked Huber, looking frightened. Bauman reached for the gear stick. We should turn around and get out of here before they notice us. Wait, interrupted Seidel. Someone's getting out. Sure enough, a figure had appeared out of a hatch in the side of the great machine. It straightened and started walking towards them. A second figure emerged behind him. Bauman felt terror rising in him and began to wrestle with the gear stick. We should go! Hold on, interrupted Huber as he grabbed Bauman's arm. Look at the uniform. They're ours, I'm sure of it. Bauman stared at the approaching men and realized, despite the mist, that they were wearing uniforms in German grey. He took his hand off the gear stick. The foremost man, who wore the uniform of an officer, drew alongside and peered into their cab. Who are you? He demanded. Where are you going? Huber offered a clumsy salute. We have been taking bodies to the burial pits, sir, and are now returning to the field hospital. I see. The officer contemplated the three of them for a moment as the other man, a corporal, joined them. The field hospital will have to wait. We have more important work for you to do. Get out and follow us, bitte. The three privates dutifully, and in Bauman's case reluctantly, clambered out of the truck and hastened after the two strangers as they walked purposefully back in the direction of their machine. It was a British landship, all right, painted in khaki brown, but as they drew nearer to it, they saw it from a different angle and took in the big German crosses that had been painted in black on its sides. The officer halted them on the track beside the vehicle and made them form a ragged line before him. He was a young, good-looking man with jet-black hair and a sensitive face. He looked tired, but there was no doubting the steel in his dark eyes. The situation is this, he began. We captured this Mark IV Beutepanzer more or less intact from the British a few weeks ago. It has since been overhauled and, as you can see, painted with new markings for use by our side. Dozens more captured British Mark IV tank wagons are currently being repaired and in due course will join this one for use in next year's offensives. So it is just the first of many. With these machines we will win the war. He paused. I have been detailed to get this machine from the railhead to a forward assembly area, but I am short of crew. The Mark IV is operated in action by a crew of 12, but we need only 4 men to drive it the few miles to where it needs to be. As you see, I have only the corporal here and myself, so, as we carry no radio, I require 2 of you to volunteer to assist with the task. Seidel shifted uneasily under the officer's gaze. But, sir, we know nothing about operating such machines. It is simple enough, and the corporal and I will explain how everything works to the 2 of you who volunteer. The other man can take your truck back to the hospital. Huber cast an eye around the deserted landscape that surrounded them. What happened to the original crew, sir? The officer stared at him for a moment. That doesn't matter. What does matter is that I need you to take their place. Seidel drew himself up. I'm sorry, sir. We have orders to return with the truck to the field hospital. The officer glared at him. I am countermanding those orders. The dead can wait. I repeat, I need 2 of you here. Who is it to be? Bauman, who had been admiring the machine guns poking lethally from each side of the vehicle's hull, spoke first. It seemed a safe enough job. They weren't being asked to go into battle, after all, and it would be interesting to take a ride in the strange machine. Besides, there might be a reward for them if they helped out. I will help you, sir. I would like to see how this machine of yours works. Sehr good. And the other man? Seidel still looked reluctant, so Huber shrugged. I suppose it will be all right if I help you, if it is not so very far. The officer nodded. Danke. He turned to Seidel and produced a pencil and a piece of paper from his pocket. You will drive your truck back to the hospital. When you arrive there, tell them to pass on this message. He scribbled something on the scrap of paper. They are to send word to the officer named here that I have been delayed, and if possible to send extra crew out to meet us. Seidel took the paper from him. What name shall I give, sir? Lieutenant Solomon Levi. They know me. Tell them, if possible, to send me drivers. Then these men can return to their unit. Seidel pocketed the note and saluted, and the lieutenant escorted him briskly back to the truck. He watched while Seidel started the engine up, then climbed into the driver's seat and moved off. Baumann leaned towards Huber, his lip curling. Solomon Levi, a Jewish name, just our luck. The corporal overheard and interrupted sharply. "What's that? What does it matter to you if he's a Jew? I suppose you think you should be the lieutenant and he the private." He looked Baumann up and down. "I'd sooner put my life in his hands than yours." Baumann shrugged defensively. "Why should a Jew be made an officer when there's good Germans everywhere? That's all I'm asking." The corporal took a swift step forwards and grasped a fistful of Baumann's tunic, then pulled the startled private towards him until their faces were almost touching. "Listen to me, you oaf," he hissed. "Lieutenant Levi is the best officer I have ever served under. It's only because of him that I stayed after the others." He glared at Baumann, then released his grip and pushed him away. Huber cleared his throat to warn them of the officer's approach. Lieutenant Levi smacked his hands together. "So, let's get moving. Corporal, give these men a quick tour of the vehicle and then take them inside to explain their duties. I'm going to make sure the stowage on the roof is securely fastened." He started to clamber up onto the top of the vehicle, where a dozen fuel cans and various other items of equipment, such as a towing cable and some spare track plates, had been lashed down in the storage area, where the roof sloped to meet the backplate. The corporal looked up at him. "Let me do that for you, mynheer." "No," the lieutenant replied over his shoulder. "I prefer to do it myself. We don't want things shifting around again and making more of those noises." The corporal frowned, but turned obediently to the two men awaiting instructions. "Have either of you seen a tank wagon before?" Huber and Baumann shook their heads. "There's not much you need to know. You won't be operating it in action, so I will only give the basic facts." He cleared his throat and jerked his thumb at the huge vehicle. "The Mark IV weighs 28 tons and can reach speeds of nearly 6 kilometers an hour. It has an operating range of 35 miles. It is steered by controlling the caterpillar tracks you see on each side. If the left-hand track is slowed down by use of the gears, then the vehicle will turn to the left. If the right-hand track is slowed down, then the vehicle will turn to the right. The oak beam you see across the top is the unditching beam, which is deployed should the vehicle get bogged down. This is the female version, so it has British Lewis guns on both sides and at the front. The male version has larger sponsons on the side of the hull for heavier guns. Now come round here." He led them round to the front of the machine, where they were confronted by a metal cab that protruded above the two exposed head-high caterpillar tracks. A Lewis machine gun poked from a ball mounting between two rectangular hinged visors, through which the drivers could see ahead. "The front of the vehicle is protected by 12 millimeters of armor. The sides have 8 millimeter plate armor, and the roof and rear have 6 millimeters. Nothing can penetrate this armor except a direct hit from artillery. Even our armor-piercing K rounds have no effect." Baumann nodded appreciatively. He liked the idea of inflicting death on an enemy at no apparent personal risk. It was something he began to feel that he might enjoy doing himself if the chance arose. "That's enough about the exterior," the corporal said, rather gruffly. "Now follow me inside. Take off your coats. You won't need them, and it's cramped enough in there as it is." The corporal went back round the side and ducked under the sponson and through the open hatch doors in the hull's lower side. Baumann stood behind Huber as he removed his coat and crouched to enter, but then the other man paused as he stared into the darkness within. "What's the matter?" Baumann muttered. "Scared?" Huber placed his hands on the sides of the hatch. "Something doesn't feel right," he whispered back. "I'm getting a bad feeling." Baumann sniggered. "What kind of idiot child are you? A bad feeling? Los, get out of the way and let a real man in." Baumann shoved Huber roughly aside and clambered into the interior, leaving the other man to follow him more cautiously. It was a dim and mysterious space they found themselves in, illuminated by shafts of light coming through the driver's visors and through an overhead hatch, as well as through various smaller vision slits. They found that it was possible to stand up straight inside, but despite the length of the vehicle, it still felt confined and crowded with equipment. The space immediately in front of them was filled with the engine. Towards the front end were 2 seats for the drivers, raised on a metal bench so they could see through the visors. Between them was the Lewis gun that pointed forwards. The other Lewis guns could be operated from within the sponsons sticking out from the hull walls. "You can see easily enough how things are arranged," the corporal told them. "The lieutenant sits in the front left seat and acts as steersman, operating the steering brake levers. The other driver sits in the seat to his right and operates the clutch and brake pedals. Which of you will it be?" Huber did not seem to hear the question. Instead, he was gazing about the interior of the vehicle with a pinched and distracted expression on his face. Baumann decided to volunteer for the role. At least he would be able to sit down. "I'll do it." "Right. It takes 4 men to steer the machine. As well as the 2 drivers, there are 2 gearsmen who operate the secondary gears controlling the tracks. I'll operate one, and you," he informed Huber, tapping him on the arm and making him jump slightly, "will operate the other." Huber nodded vaguely. Overhead they could hear the lieutenant adjusting the positioning of the stowage on the roof outside. "Any questions?" asked the corporal. Huber coughed softly. "Just one. How exactly did we capture this tank wagon, Corporal? There doesn't seem to be any damage anywhere." The corporal looked uncomfortable, and for several seconds it seemed he would not answer. Then he took a deep breath. "It was involved in a big attack, but ditched in soft ground and couldn't get out again. The crew tried to maneuver out of trouble, but couldn't leave the vehicle because they were under heavy machine gun and rifle fire from our infantry. In the end, the exhaust stopped working and they were overcome by carbon monoxide fumes. They were all found dead inside, still at their posts." There was a brief silence. Huber looked pale, but offered nothing in reply. Then Baumann spotted something stuck on the metal hull beside the seat he had volunteered to occupy. "What's this?" He reached out a hand towards the small photograph that had been pasted there. "Don't touch it!" the corporal barked. Baumann withdrew his hand and peered at the picture. It showed a group of 8 men in British uniform, all smiling in front of what looked like the machine they were now standing in. The figure who really arrested his attention, however, was the man in the middle of the group. He wore an officer's uniform, but his face was concealed behind what seemed to be some kind of leather and chainmail masked helmet, his eyes concealed behind goggles. "That's a photograph of the original British crew," the corporal informed them in a low voice, as though worried that the lieutenant above might overhear. "It's been there since we captured the tank, and no one is to remove it." "Why not?" "In case it's bad luck," Huber whispered, staring in awe at the photograph. "We should leave it alone." "Quite," said the corporal shortly. "What's he got over his face?" asked Baumann, squinting at the odd figure in the middle of the group. "It's a helmet they sometimes give to the British crews," the corporal explained. "They protect the head from fragments of metal and paint that can fly around the interior if the hull is hit by gunfire." He gave Baumann a severe look. "You are not to touch it. They warned us at the factory to leave it where it was, else—" "Else what?" "Else there was an accident when someone moved it before, that's all." The corporal straightened up. "Now, start getting a feel of the controls you will be handling, the pair of you, while I see if the lieutenant needs any help." The corporal ducked out of the hatch, leaving the 2 of them alone. Huber hovered uncertainly around his post, looking sick and anxious. Baumann eased himself into the driver's seat and toyed with the pedals he found beneath his feet. Then his gaze settled on the photograph once again. "I don't care what anyone says. I'm not having them stare at me the whole time," he murmured. Before Huber could stop him, he had ripped the photograph off the hull and was fishing in his pocket for a suitable replacement. "What are you doing?" hissed Huber, thunderstruck. Baumann selected the photograph he had found earlier that day of the sturdy young woman with the interesting body and stuck it up where the other picture had been. "There, that's much better." He turned, smirking, in time to see Huber crossing himself feverishly. "What's the matter with you?" he demanded scornfully. "Don't tell me you've got the shivers again." Huber scowled, but didn't answer. A moment later the lieutenant lowered himself through the open hatch in the roof of the driver's cab, and the corporal re-entered through the hatch doors. "So," began the lieutenant, "I gather the corporal has shown you round. Now I shall instruct you in the correct management of the controls in front of you. It's all quite straightforward." It took the lieutenant only a couple of minutes to explain their duties. Efficient handling of the machine, it appeared, depended upon good coordination between the various members of the crew. All 4 drivers needed to work together, obeying any instruction to change direction without delay. If everyone acted together, then the machine would turn smoothly as desired. He ran through the instructions one more time, then made each of them repeat them back to him until he was satisfied that they understood the procedure. Huber found the levers controlling the tracks awkward to operate, so the corporal demonstrated their use for him. "The main difficulty," Lieutenant Levi resumed, "is that there is a great deal of noise in here once the engine starts, and it is impossible to hear shouted orders. Instead, I shall signal changes in direction by hitting the hull with this spanner." He lifted up a heavy, foot-long spanner and showed it to them. "I shall strike the hull once to turn right and twice to turn left. When you hear me hit the hull with the spanner, you must look at me, and I will also give you hand signals to confirm which way we are turning. Is that clear?" Baumann nodded impatiently. Of course it was clear. A child could do it. Did the man think they were idiots? Damn him and his jumped-up Jew arrogance. He hoped there would be a reckoning for him and his kind after the war. At a sign from the lieutenant, the corporal got Huber to help him turn the hand crank to start the engine. The interior of the machine was instantly filled with deafening noise and fumes. Baumann spluttered as the fumes reached him, but tried to remain alert to any orders the lieutenant beside him gave. The tank lurched forwards in response to the operation of the gears, and the lieutenant fastened his gaze upon the track ahead as they juddered forwards at walking pace, the engine roaring and the metal tracks squealing. In contrast to their truck, the tank seemed to lack sprung suspension, and Baumann and Huber felt every vibration from both the engine and the uneven surface of the road. The engine quickly heated up, and the temperature in the confined space began to climb. Coughing as the fumes wreathed around him, Baumann shuddered to think what it would be like to be going into action inside this machine with all the hatches closed. At least the air coming in from outside did something to dispel the choking clouds of smoke. A crash from the lieutenant's spanner alerted them all to the need to make an adjustment in the steering. They all looked at him, and he signalled a turn to the right. The machine answered the change almost immediately, and continued to follow the line of the twisting, undulating country track. After several more turns, signalled by a crash of the spanner on the hull wall, Baumann began to feel confident in what he was doing. He glanced over his shoulder to see what Huber was making of it all, and saw that the other man looked even more troubled and ill at ease than ever, as he tried to resist being flung about by the movement of the machine. Baumann faced forwards again and sneered inwardly at the other's fearful nature. It was disgraceful what kind of idiots they were allowing into the army these days. The tank gave a violent lurch as it dipped into a deep rut in the road. Baumann, caught unawares, fell against the lieutenant, thrusting him heavily against the metal wall. The officer cried out and tried to push him off. As he tried to disentangle himself and regain his seat, Baumann noticed that a slip of paper had slipped out of the officer's pocket as a result of their collision, and was now lying on the floor between them. He picked it up and found himself looking at a photograph of the lieutenant standing arm in arm with a slender, dark-haired young woman. Baumann saw at once that she was extraordinarily beautiful, with a vivacious expression and big, dark eyes. His pulse quickened. She was so much more beautiful than any of the girls in his own pictures. Oh, what it would mean to add such a prize to his collection! Then the lieutenant snatched the photograph from his hand and shoved him back into his seat. His eyes flashed with anger as he returned the photograph to his pocket, and Baumann felt his resentment of the man rise another notch. Who the hell did the lieutenant think he was to treat him like this? He had volunteered to help, hadn't he? Well, he wouldn't take this much longer. He wouldn't let the Kaiser himself treat him with such disrespect. The lieutenant turned back to the job in hand and grasped the spanner to bang the hull twice to signal a fresh change in direction. Bowman sullenly operated the gears and stared straight ahead, seething at the injustice of it all. There was no sign of life anywhere around them. They passed the shelled ruins of a cattle byre and then skirted a huge crater from a shell that had landed smack in the middle of the track, obliging them to make several changes of direction in succession, each signalled by a crash from the lieutenant's spanner. It was becoming almost unbearably hot inside the tank now, with the engine working at full capacity, and the exhaust pipes that led up through the roof were glowing faintly red with heat. Even with the breeze that came through the visor in front of him, the fumes made Bowman's head spin. He heard another bang of the spanner and glanced at the lieutenant for him to confirm the move, but was surprised to find the officer did not have the spanner in his hand. Instead, the officer had wheeled in his seat and was staring back at the corporal. The corporal returned his stare and looked alarmed. There was another crash, as though of the spanner landing on the metal hull, but again it was not the lieutenant who had caused it. Both the corporal and the lieutenant shot startled looks around the interior of the machine. Then the lieutenant made frantic gestures at the other man to cut the engine off. A moment later the noise died away, and they all remained motionless, with just a ringing in their ears and the fumes gradually dissipating between them. "What made—" Bowman began to ask. "Shut up, you idiot, and listen!" Lieutenant Levi snapped. Bowman glared at the officer, his eyes narrowed to slits, but fell silent. Everything was still around them now, save the hissing and creaking of the engine as it began to cool. "You heard it, didn't you?" the lieutenant demanded angrily at last, apparently addressing them all collectively. "You saw it was not me who did it? Well, didn't you?" The corporal nodded reluctantly. "Yes, Lieutenant, just like before." Lieutenant Levi swore. He looked pale and bewildered. "It can't be something loose outside. I checked everything was secure." The corporal looked thoughtful. "It could be the unditching beam, perhaps. Maybe it banged against the rails because of the vibration. Or a track plate, maybe." The lieutenant chewed his lip for a long moment. He looked like he was trying to convince himself of the corporal's explanation. "That must be it," he announced at last. "Corporal, start the engine again." The corporal gestured at Huber to help him crank the engine. After a single turn of the crank handle, the engine roared into life. Then there was another metallic crashing noise on the hull side. The lieutenant stamped his foot angrily on the floor and signalled to the corporal to cut the engine once more. Again all three of them waited in silence for the noise to be repeated. Bowman noted the look of abject terror on Huber's face. "Verdammt!" the lieutenant exclaimed after a good half-minute's quiet. "We have to find what's causing it." As he rose from his seat, he shot a glance at Bowman. "You, come with me to check outside." Lieutenant Levi stooped and clambered out through the hatchway below the starboard sponson. Bowman went out after him, closely followed by the corporal. All three of them straightened up and looked up at the lowering bulk of the machine. "I don't see anything out of place," the lieutenant observed with a puzzled tone. "Nothing that could have made that noise. I'd better check those fuel cans again." So saying, Lieutenant Levi climbed up onto the hull and began tugging at the ropes securing the fuel cans in the stowage area on the roof. Bowman turned to the corporal at his side. "Is he all right in the head? What's so bad about a noise or two?" The corporal scowled at him. "I told you already that he's a good officer, a fine officer." "Then what's all the fuss about?" The corporal shook his head. "I don't know. It happened before. The others didn't like it. They saw something too. That's why they ran off." Bowman blinked. "Ran off? They ran off?" Before the corporal could answer, Lieutenant Levi gestured impatiently at them from above. "Come up here, you two, and help me with the unditching beam. I want to check it can't shift at all." The two men climbed onto the tank's roof and began pushing at the huge beam, but all their shoving could not shift it an inch. Then they heard the crash of the spanner once again. This time the sound seemed to come from inside the tank. It was followed by a terrified scream, and a moment later Huber came tumbling out of the hatch, wide-eyed and gibbering. "What's the matter?" the lieutenant demanded. Huber lifted his face to them as he tottered to his feet. "I'm not going back in there! Never! You can't make me!" "What's the matter, damn you?" the lieutenant repeated. Huber began to back away from the machine, stumbling over the uneven terrain. "I won't go back in there! I won't!" He turned and began to run as fast as he could over the muddy, cratered ground. "Come back!" the lieutenant ordered at the top of his voice. "Come back, or I'll shoot you for desertion!" He fumbled at the flap of his holster and pulled out his revolver. "Come back here!" Huber shot a terrified look over his shoulder. Lieutenant Levi levelled his gun at him, but Huber just shook his head and carried on running. The lieutenant closed an eye to correct his aim and straightened his arm. Bauman braced himself in gleeful anticipation for the fatal shot, his eyes fixed on the retreating figure. Then the lieutenant swore under his breath and returned the revolver to its holster. "Corporal, get after that man and bring him back!" The corporal jumped to the ground and hastened off in pursuit of the fleeing private, who had almost vanished into the mist among the craters. Bauman turned to the officer, disgust and disappointment competing within him. "You could have just shot him," he pointed out. Lieutenant Levi gave him a withering stare. "And then we would not have had enough men to complete our journey, you dolt!" Bauman's lips pursed as the officer climbed down off the tank. In his opinion, Lieutenant Levi had just proved himself to be as weak as he was unjust and Jewish. Someone would have to settle him for the good of Germany, and sooner rather than later. It was heavy going for the corporal as he chased after Huber through the nightmarish cratered landscape. One moment he was dragging his feet out of stinking muddy slime, the next he was on hands and knees clawing his way up the sides of a crater rim or slithering down the far side into a pool of brackish yellow water. He soon lost sight of the tank wagon, and feared that he might be too far behind Huber to catch up with him either. Then they would be marooned out here until someone happened along to give them assistance. He was worried about Lieutenant Levi. The desertion of the rest of the crew had hit him hard. They had started out on their journey full of certainty that this would be the first step towards a final German victory, the amassing of a substantial armoured force to counter the British attacks and allow them to launch a devastating spring offensive of their own. Then the other crewmen had become inexplicably jumpy, complaining of strange things happening inside the machine and muddling what they were doing. The corporal had assumed it was the fumes. Then the noises had started. Finally they had seen something and had taken off into the dusk before anyone could stop them. It had all been so unexpected, inconceivable even, and he had seen the lieutenant shaken to the core. He must bring back this new man and put a stop to all this nonsense for the lieutenant's sake. The corporal caught up with Huber after rounding a shattered tree trunk and finding him sprawling helplessly in the mud a few yards ahead. With a growl of relief, he bent down to pull the man to his feet, vowing not to let go of him again until they were both back at their posts. Then he registered that Huber, who was quaking with fear and muttering incoherently, was not looking at him, but staring in terror at something immediately behind him. The corporal hesitated, frowned, and turned to see what it was. From his vantage point on top of the machine, Bauman scanned their surroundings. It was a lonely, wretched spot with no sign of life anywhere, only shattered trees, craters, and deep pools of water. The sounds of battle continued as a dull roar from beyond the murky horizon. He clambered down to the ground, where the lieutenant paced to and fro, peering in the direction in which the corporal had disappeared in pursuit of Huber. "Where the devil have they got to?" he heard the officer mutter to himself. Bauman felt a large drop of rain fall on his cap and looked up. Dark clouds filled the sky above them, and the mists were closing in. He didn't fancy being stuck out here all night. Where was that insect Huber? What was the matter with him, getting so worked up about a mere machine, for God's sake? It was just a lump of metal, nothing more. More drops began to fall. The lieutenant noticed at last and looked upwards. Then he gestured at Bauman to get back into the vehicle. "Get in," he ordered. "It's about to rain again." Bauman went back in through the hatch and returned to his driver's seat. The lieutenant followed him in, just as the rain began to pelt down and close the hatch doors behind him. Then he tore his officer's cap from his head and tossed it angrily onto the floor. "I should come and sit down, Herr Leutnant," suggested Baumann amiably, secretly revelling in the other man's discomposure. "It might be some time before the corporal catches Huber and brings him back here." The lieutenant sighed and reluctantly resumed his seat, leaning against the hull with his eyes closed. Baumann tried not to think how much he hated the other man as the rain drummed on the roof above them, sounding like bullets. There was no point asking for trouble, after all. There would come a time for a reckoning, maybe. "Who's the woman in the photograph? Your wife?" he asked nonchalantly after a minute or two. "If you don't mind me asking, Herr Leutnant?" The lieutenant's eyes opened, and he looked hard at Baumann without speaking. Baumann shifted slightly under his gaze. "My relationship to the woman in that photograph is none of your concern," the lieutenant told him in a low, dangerous tone. "A woman like that has nothing whatsoever in common with you. You are coarse and brutal. She belongs in a different world. I don't want her to have anything to do with this war and its sheer awfulness." His mouth was a taut, angry line now. "I wish to make this perfectly clear. You are not to mention her again. I won't have you talking about her. That woman is no business of yours. She never will be. Ever." The lieutenant's fists clamped tight, his knuckles showing white. Baumann felt the blackest fury surging within him. The pounding of the rain on the roof filled his brain. How was it that a man like this got to order a man like him around? He decided what was and wasn't his business, no one else. Then the lieutenant's glare was transferred to the photograph Baumann had stuck on the hull. His expression became darker still. "What the hell's that?" he hissed. "Who's done this?" Baumann's lip curled. "Do you like her, Herr Leutnant? I think she's better to look at than what was there before." The officer's face twisted with rage and fear. "You fool!" he spat out at last. "You stupid, ugly idiot! What have you done?" Baumann's expression froze. Then the lieutenant spotted the discarded photograph of the British tank crew on the floor below Baumann's pedals. "Get out of the way!" the officer demanded, half pulling Baumann from his seat and bending down to reach for the besmirched picture. "We must put it back! Dummkopf! Perhaps it's not too late!" Now out of his seat, Baumann looked down at the officer as he scrabbled about for the photograph. Then, grim-faced and silent, he picked up the officer's heavy spanner and, while Lieutenant Levi was still sprawled across the seat, raised it and brought it down with all his strength on the back of his head. He continued hitting him until the young man's head was just a pulpy mess. Baumann inspected the results and smiled. "Ouch! Not so handsome now, hein?" He laid the spanner down and reached over the lieutenant's bloodied body. Then he took the photograph of the officer's woman out of his tunic pocket and slipped it into his own. He listened for a few seconds. It was still raining, but he could not hear any sound of the other two men returning. Satisfied, he opened the hatch doors and risked a quick look outside. There was no one in sight, so he ducked back inside to retrieve the spanner and to haul the lieutenant from his seat. A few moments later he had him outside. The coast was still clear, so Baumann took a firm hold of the officer's tunic and dragged his body across the track and onto the broken ground beyond. When he had gone what he judged to be a safe distance, he chose a particularly deep, flooded crater and rolled the lieutenant's body into it, weighing it down by tucking the spanner inside the tunic. The body disappeared into the muddy water with barely a splash. Pleased with the way things had developed, Baumann returned to the machine and, after a careful wiping up of spilled blood and brains, settled himself in the lieutenant's seat to wait for the rain to stop falling and for someone to happen along. It would be easy enough to explain what had occurred, he told himself. He'd describe how the coward Huber deserted and how the corporal ran off after him. Nein, he deserted too. Even better. Let him see the corporal wriggle out of that. Then Lieutenant Levi had told him to stay with the tank wagon and had gone off in pursuit of the others. If they ever found the officer's body, they'd assume he had fallen into the crater and drowned, weighed down by the heavy spanner he was carrying as he chased after the deserters. Natürlich, he, the loyal bowman, had stuck by his duty despite the chaos going on around him, mindful of Germany's need. They would surely see the sense in that, congratulate him even. He might get a medal. Think of the respect that would give him. He contemplated his surroundings. They might let him take command of the tank wagon itself, give him his own crew to lead. He imagined the slaughter this machine would bring to the armies arrayed against them, the British, Canadians, Americans, Indians, the whole stinking lot of them, and all with him at the helm. Yes, things were turning out very well for him. He took out the lieutenant's photograph and gazed in drooling wonder at the dark-haired beauty standing beside him. Then, very carefully, he tore the lieutenant off and crumpled the unwanted scrap of paper in his hand before letting it drop to the floor. Ja, she was certainly a good-looking woman. Perhaps he would look her up sometime, explain his heroic role in fulfilling his duty to her husband, how he had trusted her to his care before he ran off after those cowards on that tragic day. She would be so distressed and so grateful to him. It would be a fine situation he would take full advantage of. Baumann became aware that the noise of the rain had died away in the last minute or so and been replaced by an eerily complete calm. He listened, expecting to hear the odd drip or the sound of birds singing. Nothing, not even the sound of the distant guns. Then he thought he heard a noise as of someone moving about outside the tank. Ah, the corporal must be back, with Huber, perhaps. He laid the photograph down on the seat. He must be on his toes now to convince them about the absence of Lieutenant Levi. The noise appeared to be coming from the front of the tank. Baumann straightened in his seat to look through the driver's open visor to see who might be there. What he saw gave him a powerful jolt. A figure in British khaki, wearing an odd leather and chainmail masked helmet, was standing directly in front of the vehicle, staring at him. Terrified, Baumann frantically slammed both drivers' visors shut. He remained entirely still for a long moment, then somehow summoned up the courage to peer through the narrow periscope slit just above the visor, the top of his head brushing the cab roof. He drew back quickly. The figure was still there. It suddenly occurred to Baumann that there were several hatches that allowed access to the interior of the machine from outside. In fumbling haste he hurried round the interior, closing and securing all the hatches, including those in the sides of the hull and overhead. Then he sank against the engine block and tried to think. What was a British soldier doing this far behind the lines? What did it mean? Baumann considered his position. He had no weapon to fight the man off. He regretted now not keeping the lieutenant's revolver before disposing of his body. He realized he was sweating profusely and wiped his brow with his sleeve. Then he remembered the Lewis guns. Baumann quickly positioned himself behind the machine gun between the two drivers' seats. It was loaded and ready to fire, and he thought he could remember how to operate it. He pulled the charging handle as far as it would go to the rear and released it, then curled his finger round the trigger. Taking a deep breath, he peered stealthily through the periscope slit once more. The figure was still there, standing motionless before him. Without a hesitation, he fired a long burst directly at him. The machine gun blasted bullets with a staccato roar, spitting out empty shells and clouding his view with smoke. He only stopped when the magazine pan was empty, by which time he was coughing and nearly blinded by the fumes coming back at him from the weapon. When he looked out again through the periscope slit, he was relieved to see the figure was no longer there, though there was no sign of a body where it should have been. Baumann let go of the machine gun and tried to calm himself down. He was in no danger in here. What had the corporal told them? Nothing less than a field gun could break through this armour plating. It was too misty and wet for aircraft, so there was no danger of being bombed. Even if the masked stranger had somehow dodged the fusillade of bullets from the Lewis gun, what could one lone, probably lost British tankman do? If Lord George and President Wilson themselves were out there right now, there would be nothing they could do against him. Bauman began to feel a little better about his situation. He congratulated himself on his state of invulnerability and roundly cursed Germany's enemies. Yeah, he was a fool for letting the masked stranger worry him. He pressed his mouth to the vision slit in the side of the cab. "Achtung! You out there!" he shouted. "You'd better run off while you still can, before I catch up with you and all the rest of your fine army. I'll chase you all the way back to Paris, and then London, too. Yeah! We'll cross the channel on a bridge of your bodies. How would you like that, eh?" He listened for a response from outside. Everything remained weirdly silent. He grunted and picked up the photograph he had stolen from the lieutenant. He stroked the image with a grubby finger, and then he pressed it to his lips. Without warning, the whole machine shook at the sound of a spanner crashing against its hull. Bauman recoiled from the front of the machine, clapping his hands to his ears. The crash sounded again and again, first at the front of the tank, then to one side, then above him, then on the other side, and then at the rear. Bauman retreated to the driver's end and curled up in a ball on the seats. All fell silent again. Bauman cowered, eyes shut, not daring to move. Everything around him was still. He found himself listening for the tiniest sound, anything to convince himself he was still alive. Then he heard it, the smallest, softest shuffling noise behind him, inside the tank. For 30 seconds, maybe much longer, he remained in a terrified, paralyzed ball on the driver's seats, his eyes squeezed tight. No further sound reached him. Very, very slowly, he opened one eye in the direction of the rear of the tank. Then he opened both eyes wide in terrified horror. There, not 3 feet away, stood the masked figure, motionless, its eyeless goggles looking down at him. For a moment that seemed to last for 1,000 years, they stared at each other without moving. Then the figure slowly raised its right arm, and Bauman saw that it clutched a heavy spanner in its hand. Bauman's body was found sprawled on the floor of the tank the following day. It appeared that he had been battered to death by the foot-long spanner that was found next to his body. It was covered with his blood and brains. His corpse was loaded into a truck to be transported to the burial pits, and a search was ordered for the missing officer who was strongly suspected of committing the crime. He had a Jewish name, so he was an obvious culprit. The dead man was presumably the corporal who had stayed with his superior to get the Beutepanzer where it should be after the rest of the crew deserted. That made him a hero, however misguided his loyalty may have been. He was only 19, and he was evidently very popular with the girls, judging by the wad of photographs found in his pocket. The expectation was that once the war was over, he would be disinterred and reburied properly with full military honours. It would not be of much consolation to him, of course, but it would be a small comfort, at least, to the lovely, dark-eyed girl in the photograph he was found clutching